Thank you all for being here. Today's program is In Conversation, Terry Evans, Mark Klett, and Laura McPhee on landscape photography and Barry Lopez. Let me go to the next slide. We at UCR Arts would like to respectfully acknowledge and recognize our responsibility to the original and current caretakers of this land, water, and air, the Cahuilla, Gabrielino, Tongva, Luiseño, and Serrano peoples, and all of their ancestors and descendants, past, present, and future. Today, this meeting place is home to many Indigenous peoples from all over the world, including UCR faculty, students, and staff, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to live and work on these homelands. So today's conversation is with three artists featured in the exhibition From Here to the Horizon, Photographs in Honor of Barry Lopez, currently on view at the California Museum of Photography through August 9th, 2026. From Here to the Horizon is curated by Toby Jurovics, founding director of the Barry Lopez Foundation for Art and Environment, and he will moderate the conversation. Prior to his position at the Barry Lopez Foundation, he was chief curator at Joslin Art Museum and a curator of photography at the Smithsonian American Art Museum and the Princeton University Art Museum. A specialist in 19th and 20th century American landscape photography, he has curated over 60 exhibitions and published essays on Thomas Joshua Cooper, Steve Finch, John Gossage, Timothy O'Sullivan, and the New Topographics. And I'm just showing some exhibition images, some installation images as we go through. Terry Evans photographs the prairies and plains of North America, combining both aerial and ground photography. She delves into the complex relationships of land and people, advocating for environmental justice and celebrating the intricacies of prairie ecosystems where she finds them. Evans is a Guggenheim Fellow and a recipient of an anonymous Was a Woman Award. She has had one-person shows at the Chicago Art Institute, Field Museum of Natural History, Amon Carter Museum of Art, and a retrospective show at Nelson Atkins Museum of Art. Her work is in many museum collections, including the Spencer Museum of Art, the primary repository of her work. Laura McPhee's landscape photographs made in the American West provoke questions about our attitudes and beliefs about the earth we inhabit. Questions sometimes environmental, sometimes cultural and geographical. Made with film and a large format view camera, the photographs envelop time, both geologic and human. Laura's work has been widely exhibited both in the United States and abroad, and she's had the good fortune to be the recipient of a number of grants and residencies. Her photographs are included in the permanent collection of many museums, including the Getty Center, the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, the Museum of Fine Arts in Houston, the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, and the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. Laura McPhee enjoyed decades of teaching extraordinary students at the Massachusetts College of Art and Design in Boston. Mark Klett is a photographer interested in places, history, and time. He has received fellowships from the Guggenheim Foundation, the Pollock-Krasner Foundation, the National Endowment for the Arts, and the Japan-U.S. Friendship Commission. His work has been exhibited and published in the United States and internationally for over 40 years and is held in over 80 museum collections worldwide. He's the author of 20 books. Klett is Professor Emeritus at Arizona State University. So now I'll hand it over to Toby to get the conversation started and talk a little bit more about the exhibition. I did want to mention that we'll have some time for questions from the audience at the end. So please go ahead and just drop those in the Q&A box throughout the conversation, and we'll get to those in the last like 10 or 15 minutes of the program. So I'll hand it over to you, Toby.
Thanks. Good afternoon. As you said, I'm director of the Barry Lopez Foundation for Art and Environment. And I'd like to thank everybody for joining us this afternoon. And I'd especially like to thank everybody at the California Museum of Photography. They could not have done a more beautiful job installing the exhibition. And I hope that everybody who's here virtually today will have a chance to see it in person. I'd also just like to mention our partner, the Sheldon Museum of Art at the University of Nebraska, who we collaborated with on the exhibition and the catalog. And all of the photographs in the show are in their permanent collection now. And I'd also like to mention Marquand Books in Seattle, who produced the beautiful catalog with us. Most importantly, though, I'd like to acknowledge the photographers whose work appears in From Here to the Horizon. Every work in this show was a gift. About how many years ago it was? About 6 years ago, I sent out 50 letters asking people to contribute to a collection for Barry on the occasion of his upcoming 75th birthday. And every single person said yes, which is really a testament to Barry's influence and the respect he had into his friendships. And after the catalog came out, Robert Adams wrote me a note and he said, you know what this is? It's really just a book by a bunch of friends. And I think that's a really kind of lovely way of looking at it. So who is Barry Lopez? When I recently gave a talk at the museum, I asked that question, and one person out of 40 raised their hands. But that's okay. There's no quiz. But Barry, as an author, he was often called a naturalist. But he said he kind of bristled at the fact that when he went to the bookstore, all of his books were piled into the nature section, and he kind of bristled at the narrowness of that definition. He's best known as the author of Arctic Dreams, Imagination, and Desire in Northern Landscape, which was this just expansive account of the American and Canadian Arctic in the early 80s, kind of right at the moment where we're looking at the kind of industrialization of this landscape, and then right before, by a period of only a year or two when we became kind of culturally aware of the emerging science of climate change. So it is this book that really sits at this important pivot point. He was also the author of Wolves and Men, the memoir Horizon, 10 works of fiction, and 3 volumes of essays, including the posthumous Embrace Fearlessly the Burning World. So why are we all here celebrating a writer with the photography book? Barry actually began his career working as both a photographer and a writer. But in an essay called Learning to See, he wrote about kind of his affinity for both of these mediums, but then why he decided to put the camera down for good. He said he was working with a group of marine biologists in the Beaufort Sea, and they were in an open boat, and they were working their way back to this main research vessel, and they came upon a polar bear. And he talks about following this polar bear through the floe ice and watching as the bear would kind of climb up onto the ice and shake himself off and turn around and hiss, walk across and drop back in. And he said, as soon as we got back to the boat, I ran to my cabin and I tried to recall all of the details I could about this encounter. And he said, attending to the camera during our time with the bear had altered and shrunk my memory of it, and I knew I would never pick up the camera again. Now, pardon me, I think this is less an indictment of photography, but rather an acknowledgement that when you're doing something really well, you can only attend to one thing at a time. And he continued that even though I no longer photograph, I've maintained a connection with photographers, and I keep up a sort of running conversation with a lot of them. I think what he recognized in these conversations was a kind of shared intensity of observation and often a shared sense of our kind of moral and ethical responsibility to the landscape. And it's easy to understand how that kind of bright, sharp attention to detail that you see in his writing could likewise be considered a sort of form of photographic precision. And just yesterday, I got a letter from somebody and they said Barry's use of language seems almost like its own version of visual art as much as it is of writing. And I think we really have that sense. If you've read, let's say, one of Barry's accounts of the Arctic, if somebody's kind of deposited you on the edge of the Arctic Ocean, I think you could, kind of look around and take your bearings, and you'd know exactly where you were as if you'd been looking at a photograph of it before. And this was, I think, also kind of a two-way street. Maybe 20 years ago, I was giving a talk in Colorado. Joanne Brennan, I think you're out there. It was one of your classes. And a student asked me about this particularly turgid piece of photography criticism and wanted my opinion of it. And I said I'd never read it. And they were sort of shocked that as a curator, I didn't feel obligated to. And I said, no, I read what photographers read. And they said, well, what's that? And without thinking, I said, photographers read Barry Lopez. Um, 2 decades later, as the collection began to take shape, I received this email from Virginia Bean, whose work is in the show. And she said, Barry's writing has been a major influence for me. I carried Arctic Dreams around for years, sharing passages and ideas from it with anybody who would listen. What impressed me so much about Barry's writing, and about Arctic Dreams in particular, was the slow-moving attention to detail. I felt like he was with me, using his version of a view camera, or I was with him, as he studied and thought about and tried to make sense of the world. So I think, as Virginia is saying, that his use of language feels familiar to artists who are accustomed to studying kind of every edge and corner of a ground glass or the viewfinder before making an exposure. So what is this exhibition? It is, in fact, it is based on a book. Here it is, if you can see that. It's called Home Ground, a guide to the American landscape. And it's what Barry described as a reader's dictionary of our national topography. He assembled it with his wife, Deborah Gwartney, and it contains 800 entries by 45 novelists and essayists and poets who he asked to describe the places that they know most closely, the places they're born, the places that they live now, and to describe them from kind of not in a scientific sense or as a geographer, but as somebody who spends time in the land and how it relates to them personally. And the project arose from his concern that as our lives have become further and further distanced from the land, we've even forgotten the words that we used to describe the places that have shaped us and formed us. And he said, almost without knowing it, the particulars of these landscapes have slipped away. So the goal of this exhibition was to create a kind of call and response of words and images. And you can go through and find phrases like meander or swell or sawtooth, as well as kind of the more foreboding sites of what we would consider the Anthropocene landscape, so places like tailing ponds and strip mines. In the introduction to Home Ground, which I think is really one of the most beautiful essays that Barry wrote, it's really this kind of love letter uh, to our land. He said, the seemingly unfettered, nearly immeasurable American landscape I had become acquainted with had distinctively stamped the long line of American literature. And I'd like to kind of add to that a response that I received from the photographer Greg Conniff. And he said, American space, American light, the things of this country, the things of this country that come together to form a voice that shapes how we think and feel, much as our parents' voices shaped us in childhood. So, expanding that idea, the exhibition and the catalog are really about this conversation between the camera and the landscape that's been going on for 150 years, or I guess we're getting close to 200 years now. It's something that we made explicitly clear through the image we chose for the cover, which Mark Klett will talk about shortly. And in it, you'll see his view camera perched on the edge of an outcropping in the Utah desert, and it's pointed towards the horizon. And you have this feeling like it's a tourist that's inching as closely as it can to the edge so they can get like the best possible view. The other thing is that in a way, the show is kind of retrospective in that it brings us back to the first fundamental definition of how American photography came into its own as this kind of direct record of the visual facts of the landscape. And during the last 50 or so years, the primary concern of landscape photography has been the built environment. And, much more so than working in what we might call kind of, for the sake of conversation, a wilderness landscape. The camera was kind of out roaming suburbs and highways and trying to document sort of what we had done to the land rather than the shape of the land itself. And so what Barry really hoped was that From Here to the Horizon would return as a kind of affectionate look at the terrain and landforms that had first inspired our care for the places we call home. With that, I'm going to pass us along to our photographers. Mark, as I said in a recent email, is the kind of king of that idea of the camera and the landscape. And his work has explored how photographers have taken a 10 by 12 inch glass plate or a 4 by 5 inch negative and transferred all of these vast spaces onto a sheet of paper, starting with O'Sullivan and William Bell in the 19th century and through his own work and the work of his colleagues. Um, Laura and I have known each other for 30 years and share this common ground of Princeton, New Jersey, where she grew up and went to college. And I worked as a curator at the museum. And about 5 years ago, I visited Laura in her new home in Idaho. And I remember floating down the Salmon River one day and seeing her in the bow of a kayak. And I thought, this is not something I ever expected to see. And I think it's this very American story of how over the course of our lives we can find and become connected to these multiple home grounds. Um, and Terry, who will lead us off, I would say that the plains in the Midwest have never had a better friend. Um, I lived in Omaha for a decade, and being honest, Omaha and I never really saw eye to eye. But I remember a dozen drives across western Nebraska. And in the late afternoon, there is nothing more beautiful than the way the sun comes in across the plains. And in the photograph that Terry opens with, it's the Platte River. And I just remember, driving from Denver back to Omaha and knowing that that river is off to your left and kind of following the highway back and forth. And so that's a photograph that just always makes me happy. So with that, I'll pass this over to Terry. Thank you.
Thank you, Toby. Um, there I am. So thank you for those beautiful words. I wanted to talk for a moment about how I came to that aerial perspective of the Platte River, which you'll see that picture in a minute. Um, I started photographing the prairie. Um, When I say the prairie, I mean the prairie ecosystem. There are many prairies, and actually very few left that we could really identify as an untouched prairie ecosystem. But I started photographing it back in about 1978. And one of the early things I discovered after looking carefully at the ground, and of course, I think what we all love about Barry Lopez's work is, as you mentioned, Toby, is that fierce attention to seeing and to seeing the detail. And when I first started photographing the prairie, I was looking at the ground and trying to understand the patterns of growth because it was the first untouched ecosystem I had ever seen. And it was just this 80-acre piece of untouched prairie in the middle of Kansas that belonged to my friends Nick and Joyce Fint. And I thought if I could really begin to understand the structure of this prairie. Oh, and by the way, you can see it behind me, blurry, but you can see it as I saw it um, about 40 years later when I came back for that particular reason. But the prairie, the complexity and beauty of the prairie was it was so huge. And yet, when I looked across the Kansas landscape to the horizon, from here to horizon, as Toby has named his book, um, there was the activity was happening only at that horizon line. I was looking straight across, and then there'd be this tiny bit of activity at the horizon off in the distance, and then the sky. And so I thought, I wonder what this looks like from an aerial perspective. If I could look down, maybe I could see it better and understand better. So I started doing some aerial photography with a small plane and a pilot in Kansas, not far from where we lived. And um, and it was extraordinary. And I really wanted to see what the Platte River had actually looked like. And I had read about it. The quote that is attributed to Mark Twain, but apparently he didn't really say, was that the Platte River was a mile wide and an inch deep. And so it was only a quick, probably hour flight in this little plane. And so we went up there to look at it. That was in 1990, after I'd already been photographing the prairie for about 12 years. I really love this image because um, you do get this sense of the river meandering. And in Barry's book, it is meander that is beside this picture. And I also was very happy that Toby put it beside his essay. But so I took a lot of pictures that day with my Hasselblad, which was a great camera for aerial photography. And I wanted to read you something. I didn't know Barry Lopez personally, but I still feel like I was in a constant dialogue with him. And I want to read you what he says also in this beautiful intro from Home Ground. And he says, um, oh, he's talking about some hand-drawn maps that he had been looking at. And he said the maps are in harmony with the unprecedented views humans first experienced in the initial decades of the age of flight, when pilots navigated by looking at the ground below, when they became the first of us to take in entire creek drainages at a glance, when, like Burl Markham and Saint-Exupéry, they were dazzled by the scope of what they could see, by the detail in it, not yet obscured by speed, greater altitude, and fouled air. And I love this. Yes, they must have been just dazzled by it when they flew over very slowly, because that's how I always feel, just dazzled by it. And I've been fortunate to work with pilots who feel the same way. That's the very reason they're flying. And so this was a dazzling experience to get to see this Platte River meandering across the landscape. Um, and the next one, please. So that picture of the Platte River was made in 1990. This one was made much later in 2009. And I had been photographing a tiny town of Matfield Green, Kansas, in southeastern Kansas, in the Flint Hills. And in those Flint Hills, um, they're very beautiful, and they are really used primarily for cattle grazing. And in this little town, so many of the people who live there don't own land. They live in this little town. Much of the land is owned by outside owners who don't really have a sense of place there. And there are trains that go through up above the town several times a day. And I really wanted to get a picture showing one of these freight trains going across the Flint Hills, this Flint Hills landscape by Matfield Green in Chase County, Kansas. And so this is that picture. I was very lucky, I think, to have a few orange freight cars in there with that green. This was made in June of 2009. So the next picture, please. So Barry asked me to talk to him, to talk to you about what it was like to move from Kansas to Chicago. So I had been photographing. Actually, let's go back to the train one again. It's more pleasing at the moment. I'd been photographing this prairie landscape um, for about 20 years when we moved to Chicago. And we moved to Chicago for my husband Sam's work. And I was very happy to go. I like Chicago. But when we got there, the first day, the first night, he said, I stayed back in Kansas for about a year because our daughter needed to finish high school, and we wanted to have this place for her that where we had always lived and where she had grown up. And then when she left for college, I moved to join Sam, and it seemed like something I could do. And the first night, he took me to a restaurant. He said, I have a surprise for you. And when we got there, I saw that the name of the restaurant was Prairie, and I burst out crying. And that went on for some months until finally, so it just really went on. Someone would ask me about the prairie, and I would start crying. And I missed it so much. I missed my home landscape so much. But I also was growing to love Chicago, the city of big shoulders. And as as the great poet Carl Sandburg called it, the city of big shoulders. And we lived in Hyde Park, just about 15 minutes north of the southeast side of Chicago, where there is lots of industry. And in 2011, I'm going back a little bit. In 2011, my friend and colleague, journalist Elizabeth Farnsworth, and I decided to photograph North Dakota, the oil boom that was going on in North Dakota. And one of the reasons I wanted to do that is that I felt that I had already explored just about everything I could think of that had to do with prairie. I had worked on many projects, always for myself, always wanting to understand more the stories of the prairie. But when we were in North Dakota, I began to see the damage that was being done by fracking to local people and uh, and and to the land itself. And so I decided that when I got back home, I wanted to bring more advocacy for the prairie to my own work and my own voice. And I joined a group of activists in Southeast Chicago, um, which is where all the steel mills used to be. And they lived in this neighborhood. The steel mills had been shut down in the 1980s, but this is a uh, very strong working class neighborhood where people are very proud of their work and proud of the contributions to their city. These are the teachers and policemen and construction workers and every other kind of work in Southeast Chicago. And in this small group of activists, what they were doing was fighting the pet coke. This is what you see here, petroleum coke, which, as you may know, is made from very dirty oil that is shipped down from the tar sands of Alberta, and in this case is refined at the BP refinery right over the border of Chicago. So those poles that you see spray to supposedly hold down the dust, but they don't hold down the dust. And the dust from this petroleum coke, which is the waste material left after refining, that's dirty oil from the tar sands. So this petcoke is blowing into the neighborhoods and into people's homes and into their lungs and into all of their lives. Just I will quickly say that what happened is that these local activists, in their own, a small group, held community meetings, they held marches, they made phone calls, and in the end, they got the city to force Coke Industries to move this these piles of petroleum coke somewhere else. And this picture that you see right now, right there, is now a truck parking lot. And so now my last picture. When we left Kansas, we 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 sold our house in town, but we kept this land that Sam's father had bought in 1954, and it was very important to our whole family. It was pasture and also had a nice meadow on it, which was mowed for hay. And this is that hay meadow, and it's made up of the multiple images so that maybe you would have the same feeling of walking through it that I had. And I'm going to stop right there. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Terry.
Okay, thanks, Terry. I guess, am I up? I'll start.
You're up.
This is the name of the show. You can go to the next one, Lindsay. Next slide, please. Toby suggested that I talk about the camera and the landscape, so I took that seriously, and I'll show you some work related to that, to what that means to me. This is the name of the show, My Camera at the Head of Sinbad. I took a lot of photographs of other people photographing and cameras next, including this view using Linda Connor's camera in Monument Valley called Under the Dark Cloth. The photograph to me was made in response to the idea that photographs create iconography. And what we think we know about the land often comes conditioned by somebody's lens. Next. This is Linda herself making a picture of a petrified forest. Next. I photographed other people. This is the photographer David Heiser, National Geographic, photographing Baseball Man, a pictograph along the San Juan River. Next. This is a picture I made of the Space Shuttle Columbia landing on July 4th, 1982, with 500,000 people watching and pointing their cameras. You can see the space shuttle at the very top of the frame, just slightly off center to the right. 500,000 cameras focused on one object. Next. This is the tripod of my friend and mentor, Michael Bishop, left on a sandstone formation in Lake Powell. Next. And I made photographs that didn't have to do with cameras, but had to do with the framing of the camera, because in a lot of ways, that's what it's all about, as in framing the view or forming the image. And that kind of framing, as much as the camera, is a form of instruction, how to see something. Next. And this photograph was my reference to landscape photography as the equivalent to the shadows on Plato's cave. It's titled Witness the Sunrise. And I'm thinking we aren't really seeing reality. When we look at the photograph, we're only seeing the photographer's version of reality. Next. So my interest in cameras and landscapes began with the Rephotographic Survey Project in the 1970s. And what we wanted to do was exactly revisit the original camera positions of 19th century photographs, like this one by O'Sullivan on the left of Green River. Next. And what we needed to do was find the exact position of his original camera, which we call the vantage point. So things about cameras in the landscape is that it's not arbitrary. Next. We went back to this place 20 years later and explored how technology can be used to look at what the camera captures differently. You can hit the next button, it'll play a video here. So we can look at now things differently because it's electronic. We can turn on the color and go back to the first view. And my colleague, Byron Wolf, created this incredible feature where you can look through time by moving around a time window, a time reveal window. And what we began to understand was that photographs really exist as layers in time. And the lesson here was that space can be repeated. You can go back to a place over time and look at it again, but time cannot be repeated. Next. We also learned that technology taught us something about photographs, that they don't exist alone. They're usually in existence with each other. So a picture like this by O'Sullivan, first photograph of his in Green River of the Teapot Rock and the Sugar Bowl, next, we can see is actually related to a lot of other pictures. Next, just advance that, yeah. And there's 5 different photographs taken of this place in different positions by O'Sullivan and William Henry Jackson. And I think one of them is a Savage picture too. And basically, what we can understand is that we can suddenly understand this is a 3-dimensional space that the photographs relate to. Next. This is from Yosemite in Time with Byron Wolf and Rebecca Solnit. And what we were trying to figure out was the relationship between vision and space, because they're really different things. This is Ansel Adams' view of Lake Tenaya and Mount Conness. Next. See, this is Edward Weston's view of Lake Tenaya, made about a few years earlier. Adams was 1940s, this is 1930s. Next. And we didn't know it was related to this picture by Edward Muybridge in the 1870s. And we'll see if this works. Just go next and we'll see if we get something out of this. You can see there's a panorama of the scene. We can connect Muybridge to the scene. That's Byron swatting the mosquitoes up there. Next. Yeah, this is where we lose it. Let's go to the next one and we'll see if it works. Because the next one should show, well, that's where Edward Weston made his picture. And next, it's kind of screwed up, but I hope you get the idea. And that's where Ansel Adams made his picture from. So we can combine these, and it's possible in a place of high image density. Go back to the little camera that he's holding in the picture. Next view, next slide. That's it. Right where Muybridge and Weston stood years ago, decades earlier, on the beach was this little toy camera sitting there, marking the vantage point. Okay, next. That project taught me another lesson about humility. We were trying to photograph this Agassiz column by Carlton Watkins, trying to rephotograph this scene by beautiful photograph by Watkins. And next, what happened was the lens rolled out of Byron's pack, rolled down an avalanche chute 300 feet and got destroyed. Next, we went and collected it. So the last picture of the project is parts of my camera on the landscape. Next. When Byron and I started a project on the Grand Canyon, we started to become playful with the way photographers have used their vision to create their personal versions of this iconic place. This is Alvin Langdon Coburn photographing on the edge of the Grand Canyon. Next. And when we went there, this is what we found. Next. There was a woman standing on her head, right next to where Coburn was standing. And next. In one picture, in one piece we did, we even tried to enter the past. This is a stereo card by William Bell from the Wheeler Expedition in 1872. Next, just progress that, it's a video. And so Byron actually walks into the scene. He's trying to figure out what that guy is doing, sitting there. Doesn't quite figure it out. So we took a little bit more of a humorous look at the history from this position. Lastly, the last thing I want to mention and show you next is more recent work. Oh, first of all, this was something we did for the iPad. So we invented this video to fit on a new technology to show photographs, a new framing device. So next, go to the next one. This is the new work. This book just came out last month called Remembering the Future, Nuclear Testing, Rising Seas in the Marshall Islands. This book chronicles the nuclear history of the Marshall Islands and also climate change. The twin existential threats to the Marshall Islands, but also threats that we also face here in the United States and elsewhere around the globe. Next slide. And I wanted to show you this picture related to this project because this is the camera core in 1946 that was used to document the nuclear testing in the Marshall Islands starting in 1946. At this time in 1946, the military bought up 1/2 of the world's film supply to document the nuclear testing in the Marshalls. Next. They documented this test, which is the Baker test, the second one in the Marshalls. And over a period between 1946 and 1958, 67 nuclear tests were detonated in the Marshall Islands. Next. There were many, many photographs made. Next. And this one was an important one for us. The Castle Bravo test in 1954, 15 megatons, the largest US detonation ever above ground. It actually destroyed and it vaporized an entire island. Next. And this bunker was directly below that blast, made out of reinforced concrete over 3 feet thick. This is a face that was blistered by the blast. And in the middle, you can see some holes. These holes were made for cameras. There were cameras pointing their lenses out to record the blast. They didn't get anything because the film was totally irradiated and destroyed. That's my colleague, Bill Fox, on the corner on the left, measuring radiation, which there wasn't any. Next. And this is the last picture. This is a bunker that was built for the purpose of photographing the hydrogen bomb. And I thought this was reminiscent of the film Planet of the Apes, where Charlton Heston discovers the Statue of Liberty on the shores of what he thought was another planet, but it turns out, in fact, it was planet Earth. Okay, that's it for me. Thank you.
So I've been making photographs as I've come to live in the West as a way to understand a new place, which far different from New Jersey, where I grew up. So here's part of the story of how I developed my relationship to the West. It began when I was invited to do a residency, a stay of a week or 10 days, 4 times a year in a cabin on this Idaho ranch. Next slide, sorry. I almost said no to that invitation, an invitation that entirely changed my life. I was a complete novice when it came to the worlds of ranching and high mountains and being alone in a big space. I quickly learned that the water running through the yard was an irrigation ditch, tended by a man with sheepdogs riding a 4-wheeled ATV, and that the blue tarp in the foreground was the low-tech way you could direct water to another part of the pasture. I learned that the fence was called a worm fence and that they're made of lodgepole pine and are very expensive because they use so much material. I learned that more than 80% of the land in Idaho belongs to the federal government, though much of it is used for commerce, grazing, mining, logging. And I learned that the Shoshones used this land to collect food in the form of salmon and elk and the bulbs of camas during the summers for centuries before the incursion of Europeans. Not that many Europeans stayed here, however, as it's one of the coldest places in the lower 48. Next slide, please. So, for example, this is June 21st, the summer solstice, and that is snow, and it's the same view. So I found myself direct from New Jersey in a cabin at 7,000 feet with this view. The person I was close to with a history in the West was my grandmother, and she was on my mind as a kind of way to access the West. She had been dead 8 years then, but she remained an important figure in my life. I imagined my grandmother standing in similar places, looking at all this splendor, and I thought how she would have seen it differently, that mountains might have meant many more hours of arduous riding. I thought that my grandmother's subjective experience was entirely lost to me, that actually we get glimmers of one another, only glimmers of one another in any case. But still, she could stand beside me there. To paraphrase a line from a novel I love, the world of our mothers resides within us. Beyond our families, we all need guides to help us understand the world and the process of making art. And for me, those guides often take the form of other artists and writers, and Barry Lopez was a central one of these. Next slide. Through his work, he modeled many of the ideas on which I have built my own work. He understood that places are not, as Rebecca Solnit puts it, passive stages that life moves across, but that they include all the presences, living and otherwise, in a place. It's animals, plants, weather, geology and hydrology, the lay of the land, the human presence, and how they all interact. That's what we are seeking as we pay careful attention to a place. Epiphany, communion, understanding, relationship. Barry was never slow to show his political beliefs, nor the ways in which his own life intersected with the world he depicted in his writing. This was all crucial to understanding, for me, to understand how to make a life in a new place, how to make a place home ground. So about 100 people lived in this valley in what appeared to be harmony with the natural world. That was so wrong. I was stunned to discover the number of contentious issues dividing these people. In this case, the scientist in the nightgown outside her house is listening for signals from radio-collared wolves. The reintroduction of wolves has been a huge bone of contention in the rural West, as they are at once protected and or shot by state employees in helicopters. Next slide, please. Another bone of contention is fire. Our policies around fire suppression over the past many decades, along with climate change, has left dry fuel on the ground in abundance. In this case, it was human error that started the fire, though often it's lightning. Thinking about the unintended consequences of human action has become a central part of my work. In this case, a man moving away from the valley was burning cardboard boxes in a burn barrel. He watched as sparks escaped, igniting the dry grasses at his feet. Over a 10-day period, 41,000 acres burned, and the fire was ultimately extinguished by snowfall. So next slide. Now I'm leaving that valley behind to show you images. Sorry, Lindsay, the next one. Oh, no, I got lost. The tree. Yeah, thank you. It didn't come up. So now I'm leaving that valley behind to show you images from the high desert West that I've been making over the past 15 years in a wider territory. Working slowly with an 8x10 view camera, I like to reflect on the intricacies and ecologies of place, as well as the records made by time, geologic and human. Like Barry Lopez, I'm always seeking the interconnectedness of things, natural, political, and personal. I believe that photographs, though they record the present moment, harbor clues to the past and intimations of the future. and that they can function as visual narrative. Next slide. I think of this work as a way of bearing witness to specific landscapes and often to forms of extraction that support the way of life most of us in privileged countries pursue. On the other hand, making this work also reminds me of the intense and diverse beauty of the world and of human ingenuity and imagination. This is the Great Salt Lake, close to the mistaken path of the Donner Party. Choosing the wrong route caused them a month's delay, a decision with famously unintended consequences. Next slide, please. The lake, once the size of Rhode Island, is disappearing due to agriculture and unfettered development in Salt Lake, along with extended drought. It's lost more than 80% of its water and 60% of its area. It's exposed 800 square miles of lakebed sediments, dense with heavy metals and organic pollutants, which are blown on the wind. Without action, the lake could be gone in 5 years. Next slide, please. This is the Wood River in Idaho as it passes through a lava flow. The lava was generated about 10,000 years ago. It's at the outer edge of the Yellowstone hotspot. Next slide. This is an intersection of geology and human history in the White River Narrows in Nevada. It's on the left, a solar calendar made by Native Americans that can be read on the solstice. On the right, bullet holes, petroglyphs, graffiti of various origins and vintages. Next slide. For me, it's crucial to actually see things I know about but can't really conceive. In this case, it's a gold mine, this one by the Black Rock Desert in Nevada, home of Burning Man. This is a cyanide heap leach gold mine where miners move 30 to 100 tons of rock, then pour cyanide all over the earth and extract an ounce of gold. 80% of it ends up in ornaments. Next slide. This is an open pit coal mine in Kemmerer, Wyoming. I seek to have a visual understanding of how we get and use energy. Next slide. Or we might get power this way. It's a solar thermal project with a tower full of molten salt outside Tonopah, Nevada. The heat generated is so intense that birds or insects, mistaking these mirrors for water, plunge into the light and are immediately vaporized to the extent that nothing falls to the ground, not even their DNA. Next slide, please. So standing by a flaming stack burning excess gas as oil is extracted is a weird and chastening experience. The light covers the ground as if you were in a stadium, and the sound is a roar emitted from the earth. All this is taking place on otherwise undeveloped public land in Montana, like this in Montana, not only in Montana. Next. And so this is one of the major things we want oil for. Next. Another issue is water, as you are all aware, particularly Colorado River water. This is Lake Mead. In the foreground is a campground that used to be lakeside. And you can see in the distance where the lake is now. Next. Tying things back to my own family and the more personal, this is a house in the town where my great-grandmother died. My great-grandmother, Glenna, taught in schoolhouses all over the West, and in making this work, I have tracked her route as best as I can find it. After leaving her husband in Ohio, she got off the train in Montana because no formal training was required in order for her to teach there. Complicating things was the fact that she had 2 daughters and that school teachers were not permitted to be married or to have families. Glenna taught on ranches and in Little, mostly down the heel towns until she died, quite young from my point of view, in Goldfield, Nevada. Once one of the richest places in the West, with a saloon that employed 80 bartenders at each shift, Goldfield was already falling apart by the time Glenna arrived at the end of the Second World War. Next slide, please. We missed one. The girl, or maybe not. Yeah, there she is. Okay. I think a lot about how the stories of women are underrepresented in the lore of the West. This is my daughter with an owl's wing and a burl. The wing fell to earth when the owl was attacked by a golden eagle in our canyon. Next. All right, we'll just go to that one. These are my nieces in the Salmon River. Next. Like Barry Lopez, I believe that we are tied to certain spots on the earth and that places can be as precious in our minds as our closest family members. This work, next, is now a book. It's called Silence So Deep It Rings, and it's just been printed in Italy and will come out this fall. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much. Thank you all. We have time for some questions in the chat. So we went over just a little bit, but I think we have, we can have time to answer a question or two. So if you have any, please feel free to put them in the chat. In the meantime, or in the Q&A box. I think I see one right here. Here's a question for Terry Evans. Do you think that your experience photographing aerially shifted the way you photograph landscape more conventionally from the ground? I'm thinking specifically of the composite image of the prairie you showed as your last image.
Um, so I think it has, I think I was born liking an aerial perspective because I even often do close-up pictures of ground, even now, and which I was doing of the prairie before I started aerial work, and now I'm doing it of a pasture full of 100 million-year-old Dakota sandstone on our land. And I've done that same aerial perspective about specimens of plants and birds and animals collected in the Field Museum of Natural History. So I just like that way of looking with a perspective that allows me to see all the relationships of what's happening in sort of my field of view. And I do work at seeing everything before I snap the shutter. And even so, I'm always surprised when I see the final picture at details that I missed, which is also a pleasure.
Thank you. All right. I'm not seeing any other questions at the moment. Toby, did you have anything else you wanted to add?
Sure. I will I'm going to close with a quote from Barry, and again, it's from the introduction to Home Ground. And it's kind of a tricky one these days. Home Ground was published in 2006, which was a very different time in this country, and the catalog was published in 2022, and even 4 years ago was a very different time. And one of the things you think about, Mark, you said photographs create iconography. And one of the things I think about the landscape, and when we think about places, that they're this kind of steadfast presence. So If you asked me what my home ground looks like, I think of two photographs. One of them we don't have an example of here. It's Robert Adams' photograph of Los Angeles from 1978 of this smog-filled basin. And to me, it looks just like where I grew up. And you can practically taste the smog. And a lot of, you might find this to just be absolutely awful. And to me, it feels just like home. And the other picture is one of Ansel Adams. It's Winter Sunrise in Lone Pine. And it's that view of Mount Whitney with the horse kind of grazing in the pasture. And, I drive by that every couple of years, and it has not changed, even as everything around it seems to have. And so this is Barry's quote, and I guess I just um, ask you to listen to it and think about it and decide what it means for all of us. He says, "It has become a commonplace observation about American culture that we are a people groping for a renewed sense of place and community, that we want to be more meaningfully committed, less isolated. What many of us are hopeful of now, it seems, is to be able to gain or regain a sense of allegiance with our chosen places, and along with that sense of affirmation with our neighbors, a sense of affirmation with our neighbors, that the places we have chosen are beautiful, subtle, profound, and worthy of our lives." Thank you very much.
Yeah, it's beautiful. Thank you. So we hope you all can come see the exhibition in person. It's on view at the California Museum of Photography here in Riverside through August 9th, 2026. And just thank you so much to our speakers and to everyone who joined today. And we hope you have a wonderful afternoon. Thank you all.